welcome to the Watchman from TBN's Jerusalem studio. You know, I often say that I feel safer walking around Jerusalem or Tel Aviv at night than I do in Chicago, New York City, or Los Angeles. Now, you may be shocked. You may think of danger when you think of Israel, terrorism, and all the threats, and those threats are there. But take it from someone who is here very often. Israel is a very, very safe place. And the main reason it is safe, number one, the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But number two, the brave men and women of the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, the Israeli military, which has fought so many courageous campaigns since Israel was miraculously reborn as a nation in 1948. And today we are very privileged here on The Watchman to sit down with one of the finest warriors that the IDF has to offer. It's General Benny Gantz, the former chief of staff of the Israeli military. When you talk about someone who's been everywhere and seen everything, General Benny Gantz is your man. We here at The Watchman and Christians United for Israel couldn't think of a better person to join us to break down the security situation right now on Israel's borders, whether it's ISIS, Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, Palestinian terror in the West Bank. General Benny Gantz has the inside scoop. So our exclusive interview with General Gantz is coming up right after this overview of what Israel is really up against.
The nation of Israel is roughly the size of the state of New Jersey, yet on every side it finds enemies that want to erase it from the map.
They are under siege by radical Islam and have been, have fought off multiple wars, but the radicalism of Hamas and Hezbollah and other terrorist organizations is rising exponentially against the state of Israel.
To the north, there is Hezbollah, boasting an arsenal of tens of thousands of rockets aimed at every inch of the Jewish state. To the east, there is Syria, where a hellish civil war finds ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and various terror groups battling Iran, Hezbollah, and the regime of Bashar al-Assad. All of these warring factions can agree on one thing: Israel must be destroyed. It's a similar story to Israel's south in Gaza, where Hamas rules with an iron fist, stockpiling rockets and digging terror tunnels. A bit further south in Sinai, ISIS has a growing presence, and all the while Iran and its nuclear program loom.
Let's see if people are strategically honest with themselves. Is really Israeli-Palestinian issue has to do anything with it? Are we influencing anything of it? Or are we the only solid, democratic, humanitarian rock that you can find in this stormy weather?
General Benny Gantz spent 4 years leading Israel's armed forces against these various threats. He joins us today to share his insights on how Israel can remain secure in the world's most violent and unpredictable region.
Well, General Gantz, thanks so much for joining us here today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, and what a time to have you on. I've been told that there are some slight problems in the Middle East right now, slightly chaotic region, and Israel is in the middle of it. I think a good place to begin is in Syria. Obviously, Syrian civil war, massive humanitarian disaster, a lot of bad actors there. And you have the Golan Heights, a very strategic area, obviously, on Israel's border with Syria.
This is obviously a very serious challenge, but I think that we should start first saying really how tragic is the situation there, mainly for the Syrian civilians who are becoming the victims of all this event. Now, without getting excited, I don't think Assad is good, I don't think that ISIS is good, I don't think that anyone there is good. And unfortunately, those poor civilians are actually paying all the price. From Israeli perspective, however, and knowing that the Iranians are trying to set a terror base there and others are operating in this area, ISIS might send some troops, some activists in this direction. But knowing our capabilities, I think that we are well prepared. We have organized the entire border in the last few years with the right concept, right technology, right organization, right infrastructure. It's not that it's not a challenge, it is a challenge, and definitely the IDF needs to take care of it. But I think that we are secured and strong, and I sleep well at night.
I look at Syria, General, and I see Sunni jihadists battling Shia jihadists. It kind of seems like a microcosm of the broader Middle East right now, where you have Sunni and Shia at each other's throats. What are some of the challenges that presents for Israel, but also possibly some of the opportunities that presents for the Jewish state?
It creates lots of challenges for us on many levels, I would say. You can think of a huge challenge in terms of intelligence. You can think of huge challenge in terms of operational aspects, etc., etc. Obviously, huge challenge in terms of humanitarian aspects. But above all, I would say that we risk losing the stability we used to have. As far as opportunities, I think it has to do with two issues. First would be, can we align ourselves with the more moderate countries, Jordan, Saudis, Egyptians, etc. I think we're capable of doing it. It's important for us to cooperate with those people. But one of the more important things I would say is that, let's see if people are strategically honest with themselves. Is really Israeli-Palestinian issue has to do anything with it? Are we influencing anything of it? Or are we the only solid, democratic, humanitarian rock that you can find in this stormy weather? And I think this is exactly what we are. And if people will really acknowledge this very basic fact, we will be in a whole different place. So it won't solve all our operational issues. It won't solve the intelligence challenge, but it will give Israel its backwind and its backup that it needs in order to stay like we are.
Yeah. One of the major players, obviously, in this Sunni-Shia divide is the Iranian regime, marching across the region. But it seems to me, General, that Iran is not only Israel's problem. It seems to be a much broader problem.
No, by far, you're right. I mean, look, I've said it before, and I'll gladly repeat it here. Iran, it's definitely a world problem, challenge. It's a regional challenge, and it's also an Israeli challenge to a degree. At that order, I think that Iran malign activities are threatening other countries in the region. Its terrorist activities all over the globe is threatening all over the globe, and it's also potentially threatening us. We see what they have with Hezbollah. We see what they were trying to do with the Golan Heights.
These ballistic missile tests now.
Yeah, but it's true that we cannot not look at it, and nevertheless, once again, going back to what I know of Israel's security capabilities, I think that we are a very strong country.
It's great that Israel has that deterrence capability against the Iran threat.
Unfortunately, we need it. I mean, look.
Yeah, it's a dangerous neighborhood.
Yeah, well, it's true, and you rightly said, it's mainly the Iranian regime. It's not even the Persian people, which is a great culture.
That's right.
So we have nothing against the Iranians. We have nothing against the Persian. We were allies till 40, 50, 45 years ago. It's pure the regime who attracts Iran from being what it can be.
Speaking of Iran, and you mentioned Hezbollah, Iran's most dangerous terror proxy, global terror network, obviously. You've worn many hats in your distinguished career. You headed up the Northern Command in previous years. Talk about that Hezbollah threat on Israel's northern border. Look, how many rockets and missiles? Over 100,000, according to some estimates. How serious is that threat? And is there the possibility, unfortunately, that hostilities could come again?
Hezbollah have rebuilt its forces after the last Lebanon war. It's 10 years ago. Iran took care of it, of course, and financed everything and gave him everything it can. The Syrians have gave him some of their capabilities. So it is serious. Hezbollah keeps the area, in terms of us, in a very, very stable situation. Hardly any events. And he does so not because he likes us. He does
Sheikh
so.
Hassan Nasrallah.
Yeah, he understands what would happen if something goes wrong. It was Nasrallah who said years back that if would only think 2% that that's what Israel is going to do to Lebanon, he would not abduct those 3 soldiers, right?
In the 2006
In 2006 war, yeah. So can it happen again? Yes, because realities, even though that sometimes strategically speaking no one wants it, tactical event can, create a whole flame and it starts, and sometimes things are getting out of control. Do they want it? Do we want it? We never want anything from Lebanon, To exclude security, we have no interest there. So we don't have any reason to do anything, to initiate anything, right? From their perspective, I think they rightly assess that if Hezbollah is to start something, it's going to be tough for us maybe, but we will win. Hezbollah will pay dramatic price, and unfortunately Lebanon will pay the price as well.
Coming up after the break, much more with General Benny Gantz. We're talking Hamas, the threat to Israel from the south, talking about the latest wave of Palestinian terror in Jerusalem, and we'll get to know Benny Gantz, the man. That's coming up after the break. It's the Watchman. It's Christians United for Israel, only right here on TBN. Stick around.
We see it all over the internet, newspapers, and television as terror groups like ISIS, Hezbollah, and Hamas terrorize Israel. Each year, the threat increases and intensifies. Will you pray for Israel? Will you confront government officials on behalf of Israel and the Jewish people? How will you answer God if you choose to do nothing?
To see evil and not call it evil is evil. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. God will not hold us harmless. Stand up and speak up and do it now.
Join Kufi, where 2.5 million Christians across the U.S. are working together to defend Israel in our classrooms, churches, and communities. They have an active presence in over 300 college campuses and mobilize their members to communicate pro-Israel perspectives to elected officials. Visit our website, cufi.org.
And welcome back to The Watchman, only right here on TBN. We're talking to former Israeli Defense Forces Chief of Staff, General Benny Gantz, about the threats facing Israel and much more. We're taking an overall view of the region today with General Gantz. And now we end up, General Gantz, in the south. Obviously, we had Operation Protective Edge, which you oversaw for the IDF in 2014. Hamas was weakened in that conflict. But now what do we see? Do we see Hamas building back up with the rockets and missiles? We know about these terror tunnels which were exposed to the world in 2014. What's the level of the Hamas threat right now?
I believe that they are trying to rebuild their capabilities that were badly damaged during Protective Edge. It's not as easy as it was before because we have intercepted many shipments that came from Iran to Gaza in the Red Sea. The Egyptians are doing more fighting those channels. And of course, that it's harder for them on the ground, but they are trying to rebuild their capabilities. So let's seriously look at Gaza as a whole. 1.8 million who lives there, entitled to have reasonable life. It's Hamas that prevent them from having reasonable life. Look at Gaza. Gaza could become Hong Kong. Why does it have to be Gaza? If Hamas would decide not to attack Israel and to really take care of its own people, to divert all the resources that it gets to the people themselves, whether it comes from Israel, whether it's cement, whether it's merchandise, everything, just for the good of the people, it's a whole different story over there. We have zero interest in Gaza to exclude security. Prime Minister Sharon pulled everyone out. 2005, we disengaged from Gaza. I mean, what can one ask for more? Just live your life, get good education, do something good with it. So, but they have decided to attack us. You know, the only thing that came from Gaza, more than missile, is patients that came to be treated in Israeli hospitals. And I'm very proud of it. That even though they are our enemy, we don't forget that we are human beings.
It's amazing to me, General, that there have been, 4 or 5 major outbreaks with Gaza in the past decade, and they keep coming back. They're relentlessly committed to this goal of destroying Israel.
Let me tell you a story about my mother, my late mother. My mother was a Holocaust survivor. She came to Israel, and I was raised in a small village in the southern part of the country. And during Castle operation, which is 3 or 4 back, missiles reached our backyard, and I called her and asked her, "Mom, are you going to the shelter?" And she said, "No, I'm not going to the shelter. Everything is okay, etc., etc." We had a nice discussion. And then she said to me, "You know, you should never stop fighting, but never stop sending them food." So that's kind of a message that we actually hold in our both hands. We will fight as much as we need, but we will stay human. We will stay Israelis. We will stay good people as much as we can.
You look at Protective Edge in 2014, Israel goes to, I would say, unprecedented really in the annals of warfare, unprecedented steps to avoid civilian casualties. Can you talk about that a bit?
Unfortunately, Hamas and other terrorist organizations are operating from civilian surroundings and environment. It's physical, it's technical, we see them in Gaza sending missiles from backyards of houses, schools, hospitals. We see them operating, even the terrorist attack that we see now in Europe are using civilian channels of command and control. So they're using civilian infrastructure, all those cases. We had a delegation of 25 foreign chief of staff that came to visit us after the war.
After the 2014 war?
Yeah, after the 2014 war. And they said that we have set moral standards that others cannot follow. And if that's my grade, I'm fine with it.
Coming up, we know about General Gantz, the soldier, and the leader of men, the leader of Israeli soldiers. We're going to get to know a little bit more about General Gantz, the man, and how he came to the position he's in right now. It's coming up after the break. It's The Watchman, only on TBN. Don't move.
Israel's fight is our fight. We are one. We are united. We will not be discouraged. We will not be defeated. We will not be intimidated. We will not sit down. We will not be silent. We are the worst nightmare of the anti-Semites of the world. The victory is going to be ours.
Join the largest pro-Israel organization in the U.S. for the 2016 CUFI Summit in Washington, D.C., July 18th and 19th. You will hear numerous experts and have an opportunity to meet face-to-face with your government representatives and express your support for Israel. Visit our website, cufi.org, and register today for the 2016 CUFI Summit in Washington, D.C.
Let's talk about how you got to this position. You've worn so many hats, obviously, for the IDF. Now you're a private citizen, I guess you would say. But what an amazing background you have. Your parents were Holocaust survivors. Your mother left the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp weighing, I believe, 62 pounds when she left the concentration camp. General, talk about how that upbringing, the influence of your parents, what they went through. Talk about how it influenced you and your career path.
Yeah. Actually, I had great 2 parents, like we all have. They came from Europe after the war. Actually, they met on a ship that brought them to Israel, captured by the British again, sent to Cyprus, got married there. And over there, they've decided to found this village I later was born in and raised in.
In southern Israel?
In the southern part of Israel. Right. I think that the Jewish history, as we all were born into, after the Second World War and the establishing of the State of Israel, really set a very strong, active Zionist education into us all. So it's not, it's something that you raised in it. You hardly even talk about it. Look, the village I was raised in was formed of 75 families. All came from the Holocaust. So we didn't talk about the Holocaust. We lived the outcome of the Holocaust. I remember 1967, I was an 8-year-old kid. digging shelter in my backyard. In 1973, I was still not a soldier, but I had an anti-air battery, defending air defense battery in our backyard.
This is the Yom Kippur War,
Yom Kippur
67,
War.
the Six-Day War.
Yeah, since the war of 67, 73 war of the Yom Kippur, and I was helping those gunners to protect the air base, which is not far from us. So, you know, it was there. So one day I sat with my father on the grass, and he said, son, if we who build this country and you as our kids won't defend it, who will? So this is how I entered the IDF, with this kind of message. I didn't plan to stay so many years. I know I figured I'll stay 4 or 5 years, maybe 6. And obviously I knew I'm going to go to the IDF and do my best, but you know, I would say I'd go for 5, 6 years, and then, you know, every time the next assignment came up, and I said, okay, it's important, it's challenging, maybe I'll do it and then I'll retire. And all of a sudden I found myself 20 years in the IDF. So after 20 years I said, okay, I'll stay in the IDF.
Yeah.
But look, you know, it's a small country. Every place you throw a rock, you pick up something. There is a piece of history there. Everywhere you look, there is a story that you can tell yourself, that explain you what is it that you are doing and why you're doing it. So that was for myself, and we are trying, with the right adaptation and the right adjustments, I would say, to give it to our kids. Israel, it's not this only small country that hardly survived. Israel is a strong country in the region, and it will stay strong if our people will stay committed to Israel as it is right now, whether it's to defend it, whether it's to develop it, physically speaking, technically speaking, socially speaking. There is a lot that needs to be done here. But we, and I see it at home as well, we have great youth, and the next generation is better than us.
Coming up, just some final thoughts with General Benny Gantz. It's the Watchman on TBN. Stick around.
All over the internet, newspapers, and television, as terror groups like ISIS, Hezbollah, and Hamas terrorize Israel. Each year, the threat increases and intensifies. Will you pray for Israel? Will you confront government officials on behalf of Israel and the Jewish people? How will you answer God if you choose to do nothing?
To see evil and not call it evil is evil. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. God will not hold us harmless. Stand up and speak up and do it now.
Join Kufi, where 2.5 million Christians across the U.S. are working together to defend Israel in our classrooms, churches, and communities. They have an active presence in over 300 college campuses and mobilize their members to communicate pro-Israel perspectives to elected officials. Visit our website, cufi.org.
And welcome back to the Watchman from TBN's Jerusalem studio. Well, General Benny Gantz, in case you haven't noticed, has pretty much seen it all when it comes to the security threats facing Israel, whether it's the south, the north, the east. General Gantz has confronted the likes of Hezbollah, of Hamas, of Palestinian terrorists in the West Bank. So it was a real privilege and honor to talk to him today. And you would think that someone who has been through his series of experiences, been through war, been a leader of men in war, may be a bit jaded, may be a bit pessimistic, but when it comes to Israel's future, it is the exact opposite with General Benny Gantz. Take a look.
Yes, I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic because I hope for the nations around us eventually to realize that they need to secure stability, that they need to promote humanitarian and human aspects and fair regime with their own people. The alternative is very brutal. They see it and they should not accept it. So this is, I hope, for them. I'm optimistic because I know us. And defending Israel and developing it, it's a matter of necessity, strategic necessity, national necessity, And necessity is the mother nature of all invention and all this kind of stuff. So, you know, I know where I live. I know our strength, our weaknesses. I believe that we are here forever, and we will make sure that that's the situation here.